Hello, I am Dr. Mahima Nayyar, and today I am going to talk about the theories of development. Now, theories of development comprise of theories related to the entire lifespan and also related to children. Today we are going to specifically talk about theories related to children. So, what I will be doing is I will introduce the concept of introduction, and at the beginning some issues related to development. In addition to that, we will look at initial part of some of the theories. So, these theories of development will be in 2 modules. Right now, I will deal with module 1, which has 3 theories, which is related to psychodynamic, school, etiology and ecology, and the next module will cover some of the other theories. We will start with the objectives and then look at what are the different forces which have an impact on development. Now, I am going to introduce the definition of development. What exactly is development? Development is the pattern of change that begins at conception and continues through the lifespan. So, what we are saying is that it is something which begins before birth, not at birth, but before birth when the child is conceived. So, the kind of circumstances the child faces within the mother's womb is also a part of the development. Child development specifically refers to the process through which human beings typically grow and mature from infancy through adulthood. So, the entire focus of child development is till the person becomes an adult. The section now that I am going to cover is issues in development. Now, there are various debates related to how development takes place. One of the major issues is the issue of nature versus nurture. Now, what has more impact on the development of a child, the nature or the nurture? That is the biology of the child or the environment where the child is growing. The people who believed in the thesis of focusing on nature said biology determines the growth of the individual. So, whatever you inherit in terms of genes, what the parents have, will make an impact on how you grow and what happens to you. The environment does not make any difference. The biology and is the major thing which makes a difference in growth of the child. Now, the people who theorize about nurture, they talk about the fact that it is the environment which makes a difference to the child. So, no matter what the genes of the child, whatever stimulation, whatever learning that they get from the environment will determine what kind of a person they will become in the future. Let me explain with a few examples. So, the issues related to predominance of nature was that the people who propounded biology also talked about the fact that maybe if you are born in a certain household, if you are born of a certain race, then you may be superior, which could lead to stereotyping. So, suppose you are born in a house with a lot of privilege, then you will have more intelligence, you will have more privilege and you will become more successful. So, these kind of theories had a danger of stereotyping people. So, if you belong to a particular background, you will never be able to progress well because your genes are of a particular kind. Whereas, the people who focused on the environment said no matter what your genes were, if you got good stimulation, good learning opportunities, then it was likely that you were going to work well. Now, there was never a consensus on one or the other, whether nature is more important or nurture, but what is more important is the confluence of both of them. So, if your genes allow you to develop in a certain manner, suppose you have good healthy genes, but you are not given good food at the right time, you do not get enough stimulation, then even if your genes are good, you are not going to develop further. But suppose there is a certain weakness in genealogy, but with stimulation, with environment, with proper nutrition, stimulation, the child will be able to grow well. So, currently the theories combine the impact of both, that nurture and nature both are important for the development and growth of a child. So, the next issue in development is of continuity versus discontinuity. So, there were some theorists which focused on the aspect of continuity, saying that growth is a gradual process. A child learns things one by one and it is a continuous process. There is no sudden or abrupt change. Whereas the theorists who believed in discontinuity talked about stage theories, which we will talk about later. And there they emphasize that, you know, at a certain stage a child has certain skills, and when there is a next stage of development, suddenly the child has acquired newer skills. So, those were discontinuous, not necessarily that changes, you know, there was something already in the child which grows and changes gradually, but there are sudden and distinct changes. The third issue in development has been of early versus late experiences. Now, what happens in early experiences, that theorists believe that it is the early childhood experiences. For example, Bowlby talked about attachment, and he said if the children receive warmth and caregiving in the first year of birth, then they will develop further and their growth will be normal. If they are not given nurture and caregiving within that first year of birth, then there is likely that they are going to face problems later in life. So, a lot of Western theories have emphasized this early years of development. So, between 1 year to till the age of 5, and they have emphasized that it is very, very important that during these 5 years, it is a critical period that children develop well, they are given enough stimulation, warmth, love, affection, which will help them to become stable and well-rounded individuals. Whereas the later theorists have emphasized the fact that, you know, it is when children acquire the ability to reason, acquire the ability to think, that is when those are the stages that are more influential when they reach adulthood. Actually, the difference is largely in terms of Western and Eastern cultures. So, Western theories have often emphasized the early years of development, whereas Asian cultures talk about the fact that around age 6 to 7 is more important, because that is when children start reasoning and they develop cognitive abilities are more developed. So, they focus on that aspect. Before we go into the actual theories of development, I will go through the different stages of development. Some of the periods of human development, I am going to read them out. The first stage of life is the prenatal period, which is from conception to birth. In this period, the health of the mother and the experiences that she is going through become important, because what is the level of nutrition she is getting, what is the level of stress that she is facing, all that has an impact on the unborn child and will also ultimately impact the health of the child when he or she is born, which is why it is very important, and there are programs related to mother and child health to see that what is the kind of environment the mother is getting during this period. The next life stage is infancy, which includes the toddler period, which is from 2 to 3 years. This stage is between 0 to 3 years, and there are many different things happening during this period. Different theories have also looked at this particular period, which we will be looking at. Preschool years, which is between 3 to 5 years. So, before children begin schooling or they are in preliminary schools, what happens during these stages? Then there is the middle childhood, between 5 to 12 years or 13 years, early adolescence, which is 12 to 13 years, later adolescence, approximately 17 to 18 years. Now, there is a division between early and later adolescence, because the kind of issues that children face during these two periods become very different. So, what they face at 12 to 13 is very different from 17 to 18. Then is the stage of early adulthood, which is early 20s to middle 30s, middle adulthood, middle 30s to middle 60s, and later adulthood, middle 60s to death. Within these life stages, what we are focusing on is largely from the prenatal period to later adolescence. Now, we have a framework which is called as the biopsychosocial framework, which talks about the different kinds of forces which have an impact on the child. Now, we have to look at the different forces that have an impact on the development of a child. One of the main forces is the biological forces, and we discussed about them initially when we talked about the nature theorist. which said that it is the genes of the child which have an impact on what the child is going to become when he or she grows up. Then there are the psychological forces. So, it is related to intelligence, cognitive abilities, language development, that has an impact on the development and personality of the child. The third forces which come about are the socio-cultural forces, which are also very important, because these are the forces which determine what kind of culture, what kind of religion, what kind of exposure in terms of gender the child gets. See, socio-cultural forces make an impact, because suppose you are born a girl or a boy, how does the society perceive you? In our kind of setup, usually there is a strong son preference. So, sons are given more food, and sometimes their survival is better because they are given more privileges. If they fall ill, they are taken more to the hospital. So, all these constitute the socio-cultural environment where the child is born, and that has an impact on what happens to the child. Then there are the life cycle forces, which means that the same event may be challenging for somebody, whereas for another person it may create anxiety. For example, if deadlines, people face deadlines and some thrive on deadlines, the others get very anxious and are not able to perform well. So, their different life experiences have changed them, and therefore, that life cycle processes have an impact on what the child is going to become and how they are going to behave. All these in combination is called the biopsychosocial framework, and it is actually, there are different theories which emphasize each of them. Some may emphasize biology, some may emphasize psychological processes, and some may talk about the socio-cultural environment, but it is actually the combination of all of them that have an impact on development. Now that we have looked at, what we have basically covered till now is the definition of development, what is child development, what are the different life stages of development, and the different issues that take place in development. In addition to that, what are the different forces which have an impact on child development. Now we are actually coming to the theories of development. We will start with the psychodynamic theory. The psychodynamic theories largely focused on the unconscious processes. They were sequential and stage oriented. The main issue about them was the theorist focused on the fact that it's the unconscious which makes the difference, and these are not a conscious part of the personality. There are many psychodynamic theories which exist, but in this module we are going to cover the main theories, which are Freud's theory of psychosexual development and Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. These two were important theories and they influenced further theories, and now there are different formats, but which is beyond the purview of this module. You can look at the different readings to read the other psychodynamic models. Within the psychodynamic theories, one of the important things that they focused was on the fact that early childhood experiences were considered to be very important. Now, the first theory that I will talk about is the psychosexual theory, which was given by Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud actually based his theory on the patients that he saw. One of his, he has multiple concepts in his theory, and the three main concepts that he dealt with were of id, ego and superego. I will go into details of each one of them. Now, id was something that a child was born with. It was innate, it was considered to be irrational, and it did not look at anything else except what the person wanted. It worked on the pleasure principle, and for example, if a child wants ice cream, then all that they see is that they want the ice cream now. They cannot postpone that need, they can't do anything. It only understands that I want it now. That pleasure principle has to be satisfied at this point of time, which is why the concept of id is supposed to be irrational and innate. But it is also the place from where all the creative instincts of the people are supposed to come out. So, the creativity is also the spontaneity, all that belongs to the id of the individual. Now, the next stage which developed during the first year of life was ego. Now, ego operates on the reality principle, and ego tries to understand that what can be done. So, going on from the same example of wanting an ice cream, ego would then explain to the child that this is not the right time. If it's midnight, they may not be able to go out to get the ice cream, and who's going to buy it at that time. So, these kind of reality orientations came from the aspect of ego, which was the rational part of the individual. It works on the reality principle. Now, the third part of the personality came from a concept called as superego. Now, the superego is formed, it actually consists of the ideals that an individual has. It consists of all the morals that have come from parents, from teachers, from the larger culture. So, for example, what kind of diet do you eat? You can eat vegetarian food or non-vegetarian food, or what is considered to be a sin, whether lying is a problem or it's okay, or whether there are other issues that come about, comes from superego. Superego operates from the morality principle. So, it is based on the moral principle. So, we have three principles: pleasure principle, reality principle and moral principle. So, the id, ego and superego. Ego actually comes at the middle because it helps to mediate between the demands of the id and superego. Remember, all of these processes are largely unconscious, only the ego has some kind of a rational component. But why is it required to mediate between the two? Because it has biological impulses and demands. I want this and I want it now. And superego, which is also a largely unconscious process, comes from these ideals to say that it can't be done, you can't do this, you can do this. So, ego comes in between to balance both of them, because both id and superego are very demanding from the individual. Now, it's ego that helps to maintain this balance. Now, apart from this, Freud gave a number of psychosexual stages, and these are as follows. Freud also talked about the psychosexual stages of development. The first stage that he talked about was what he called as the oral stage. Now, this stage was between 0 to 18 months. So, this was largely the stage where the child breastfeeds. Here the erogenous zones, he actually talked about erogenous zones in each of his psychosexual stages of development. Now, what were these zones? These were different parts of the body, and if the child became fixated, then it could lead to several problems later in life in any of these stages. Now, the oral stage meant each stage is named after the part. Oral means the mouth. So, the child's basic sensory process was through the mouth. So, if you see small children, if you give them anything, the first thing they do is they put their objects, all toys, clothes, everything into the mouth. That is because they are learning through the mouth. That is where most of their sensory experience is coming from. So, for them to understand or feel anything, it is through the mouth. So, they put everything into the mouth. Now, it is also the primary reflex there is sucking. So, that helps in formation of attachment with the mother. Now, if the child is prevented too much from putting things into the mouth, it can also lead to a problem. If they are allowed to put everything always in the mouth and they are never stopped, that can also lead to difficulties. So, a balance has to be found in order to ensure proper development. Adults who are addicted in terms of smoking are often found to be orally fixated. The next stage which came about is the anal stage, which was between 18 months to 3 years. So, this is also the time period that you see for toilet training. So, it dealt with bladder and bowel control. So, children are learning how to control their bladder movements and bowel movements. Sometimes they may have accidents, and if they are scolded too much for these accidents, they can also become frustrated and fixated at this stage. Here the erogenous zone is, as is obvious, is the anal region. Now, two kinds of things happened here. One is the anal expulsive stage and the other is the anal retentive stage. What happened in anal expulsive stage is the fact that children would have bladder accidents, they would urinate or they would pass stool anywhere and everywhere without telling the parent or without going to the toilet. Whereas in the anal retentive stage, even when they are put on the toilet seat, they hold on to the feces. So it's about, if you see the age, it's 18 months to 3 years. They are learning independence. So what they are doing is also exerting their own authority. They do not have authority on many of the things. They have too many figures who control their lives. So this bowel and bladder control is in their hands. So sometimes out of rebellion, they either expel it everywhere, or even when you put them in a toilet seat, they want to go to the toilet, but they retain it. So often adults who are fixated, found to be very messy, are supposed to be fixated at the anal expulsions state. Adults who are unable to talk about their feelings or emotions are supposed to be anal retentive. If it has happened differently in different cultures also, if you see the Western cultures are very particular about toilet training, and they would scold and punish a child after a certain age. Whereas it's been found that in societies like Asian societies, African societies, toilet training is a much more relaxed process. So if children have a little bit of, they have toilet accidents or they do bedwetting, it's not considered, shame is not instilled in the child so easily. They are indulged to say that, they're children, they'll grow, they're explained things, and that helps to move from this stage more easily because shame is not instilled in the child. After the oral and the anal stage comes the phallic stage, which is between 3 to 6 years. Now, this was supposed to be a very complicated stage where Freud talked about concepts related to the Oedipal complex and the Electra complex. Here, basically the erogenous zones was the genitals, and what happened is when he talked about Oedipus complex, he talked about a boy being more attached and attracted to his mother, and therefore the father figure became somebody that he became hostile to. For girls, he introduced the Electra complex, where the girls became hostile to the mother and more attached to the father. What would happen here is that they would resent the opposite, the same sex parent would be resented, and the attachment would be towards the opposite sex parent. Now, because they would find the opposite sex parent as threatening, they would identify so that they could win over the affections. So, let me explain this by explaining in detail the Oedipus complex. In the Oedipus complex, the boy would become more attached to the mother and father would be seen as threatening and hostile. But in order to win over the affections of the mother, the boy would have to identify with the same sex parent, that is the father, and therefore he would take on characteristics which is more like the father. So, therefore, boys start behaving more like their fathers, this gender identification takes place. Problems arise in this stage when the child is not able to identify with the same sex parent and move on from there. The next stage of development was the latency period, which was between 6 to 12 years. Now, in this period, this was supposed to be a period which was a relatively calmer period where children started going to school, started focusing on friendships. There were not too many anxieties during this period, and this is the least stressful of all the stages of development. The last stage that they talked about was the genital stage, to say that this was 12 years plus, and children started focusing on heterosexual relationships, on growth, which was moving beyond their bodies. So, apart from what was happening to them, this was going external. Now, we look back on the stages to say that there are the oral stage, which is from 0 to 18 months, the anal stage from 18 months to 3 years, the phallic stage, which is 3 to 6, latency from 6 to 12 years, and the genital stage, which is 12 years plus. So, this is the genesis of Freudian theory. We have talked about his main id, ego and superego and the various psychosexual stages of development. But Freud's theory was considered to be very controversial also, because he emphasized the sexual aspect of personality, and many theories, other theorists disagreed with what he was talking about. So, they moved from sexual to social. So, one of the persons that we are going to talk about today is Erik Erikson, whose theory is called the psychosocial theory of development. We are going to look at the psychosocial theory of development. So, Erikson moved the focus from sexual to social, and instead of focusing on the first 5 years of personality, he talked about the entire lifespan. He divided the lifespan into 8 stages, and each stage had a crisis which had to be resolved by the person. The resolving of crisis helped the person to develop further and move ahead in his or her life. Now, Erikson was initially associated with Freud, but moved away because of the primary emphasis on sexuality to his emphasis on social, because what Erik Erikson believed was it was the social interaction of the individual which influenced the person more rather than only the sexual components of personality. Now, I will go through the different stages that Erikson has given in terms of human development. So, the first stage is a stage called trust versus mistrust. It is between birth to 1 year. This emphasizes on satisfying basic physical and emotional needs. So, when the child is born, between the time of birth and 1 year, their basic needs need to be satisfied, which consist of sleeping, holding them, feeding them. So, if the child feels that they are going to be looked after, if they cry, somebody is going to pick them up, comfort them, give them food to eat, then they develop a basic trust in human beings. Whereas, if they are left to cry for long periods of time, nobody attends to them, they are not given comfort, they tend to develop a mistrust in relationships later in life as well. So, this is the stage when trust develops. If they are looked after, it develops. If they are not looked after or they are left to cry, it does not develop. The next stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt. It is between the age of 2 to 3. It emphasizes exploration and developing self-reliance. So, between 2 to 3, children are gaining a lot of skills. They learn by exploring their environment. They are trying to become autonomous. So, we also see that this is the stage where toilet training was happening. So, they are trying to exert independence to say that we can do things ourselves, or they may have not developed all the skills. Therefore, the parental figures initiate a lot of discipline on them, but they are trying to be autonomous. So, if they are not allowed to explore and become self-reliant, if they are stopped too often, they may develop a lot of doubt in their abilities. So, what he talked about is that you have to again find a balance on how much do you curb the child's natural instincts, because the learning is going to happen through exploration at this stage. The next stage was initiative versus guilt, which is between 4 to 5 years. It emphasizes achieving a sense of competence and initiative. In this stage, children are also engaging with a lot of people outside, going beyond themselves. So, they are looking at what they can do and not, and how much initiative they can take, starting things on their own. Between the ages of 6 to 12 years, the stage was called industry versus inferiority. So, it emphasized on setting and attaining personal goals. Children were trying to learn new things, doing new things, which is industry. If they were not able to do certain things, if they have set goals on it, move out of the household, going to school, establishing a certain competency, then they could develop a sense of inferiority at this stage. The next stage is identity versus role confusion, which is between 12 to 18 years. It emphasizes on testing limits, achieving a self-identity. So, you see the stage of adolescence coming in here, where adolescents experiment, work with peers. They are more influenced by their peer group than parents. They are developing an identity, figuring out what do they want to do in life. So, till the stage of 18, they are trying to see what are they going to study, where are they going to do, what are the relationships that they are going to develop. Basically, this understanding of who am I is beginning to be dealt with at this stage. The next stage after that is intimacy versus isolation, which is between 18 to 35 years. Emphasis on achieving intimate interpersonal relationships. So, we can see that between 12 to 18, he is saying the person is trying to understand who they are and how they are going to develop. And in the next stage, they are looking at formation of interpersonal relationships. Between 18 to 35, if you look at other kind of stages, is also where careers are formed. Most people settle down. If they want to get married, not get married, look at planning a family. So, this is a stage where many changes occur, and these crises also have to be resolved successfully. To move on to the next stage, which is called as generativity versus stagnation, which is between 35 to 65. This is the emphasis on helping next generation be productive. So, according to Erikson, if he is looking at the fact, he is emphasizing heterosexual relationships and saying that by 35, if you have planned a family, then you are trying to help children move on to the next stage, helping them to develop further. The last stage was integrity versus despair, which was 65 onwards. It emphasizes on integration of life activities feeling worthwhile. According to him, this is the stage where people reassess their life goals, see what they have done in life, whether they have achieved what they wanted to or whether they have not achieved what has happened to their life. So, it is also a stage of introspection. So, you can see in the stages there is a lot of emphasis on social and engagement with others, not just what is happening to the person internally, but also what is happening outside, what are the relationships they are developing, and that influences their personality and what they are going through. We are now going to look at the theory of ethology, which was given by Konrad Lorenz. It basically looked at what kind of behavior species use to survive. It was heavily influenced by the theory of Charles Darwin, in which he talked about the survival behaviors. Now, he conducted certain experiments where he said that he conducted experiments with geese and said that whatever they looked at first, they would imprint on that person and start following them. So, what usually happens with geese is when they are born, they look at their mother and then they start following their mother. And what he did was that he presented himself first to the geese. So, as soon as they opened their eyes, they saw him, and you see pictures of geese following Lorenz around because they imprinted on him. So, he called this concept imprinting, where the first person that they looked at, they started following that person. In this theory, he also talked about critical periods of development, saying that at a certain point of time, if development occurred in a particular way, otherwise if the critical periods were missed, then there would be problems in development. Now, ethology in terms of a theory was found to be weak in further experiments, and it was found that a lot of its main tenets were overdrawn when you looked at the human population. So, some of it worked with the animals, but when applied to human beings, it was not really working well. The next theory that we are going to look at is the ecological theory, which was given by Uri Bronfenbrenner. Now, Bronfenbrenner actually looked at multiple systems, and he talked about how an individual was impacted by the multiple systems in his or her environment. This was a theory which had a large impact on social policy also, and therefore, we need to look at it in detail. The ecological theory focused both on the environment and the biology. So, Bronfenbrenner actually emphasized the fact that the environment has an influence on the child and the child also has an influence on the environment. So, it was an interacting system. Now, he gave various systems in which he placed child at the center of the system. Now, one of the first systems that he looked at was the microsystem, which consisted of activities and interaction in the child's immediate surroundings, parents, schools, friends, etc. So, what he said is that within the parents, the family system, the school, what are the influences, how do they impact the growth of the child, what are the moral values. So, what are the values of the family, the child will learn those values, where they are going to school, what is the school teaching them. So, that has an impact on the development of the child. The next system was the mesosystem, which talked about relationship among the entities involved in a child's microsystem. For example, parents' interactions with teachers, a school interactions with daycare provider. Now, all these relationships were also important, because if there are problems, like if parents do not communicate with teachers, then what is happening to the child in school may not be communicated back home, or what is happening in the daycare, the parents may not be aware. So, for a complete growth, what he emphasized was that, how are these systems, like the microsystems, the parent, the family system and the school system, which are two separate microsystems, interacting with each other to look after the development of the child. The next system was the exosystem, social institutions which affected children indirectly. For example, the parents' work settings and policies, extended family networks, mass media, community resources. Now, in this, one of the things that we look at is that what has happened with the recent law on maternity, where the maternity leave has been increased from 12 to 26 weeks. Now, what happens there is then the mother becomes more available to the child. So, what are the policies of the workplace? That is a law, but in terms of what are the policies of the workplace? Does it allow the mother to take that much leave? What are the system, if she comes back with the child, how is she allowed to take care of the child? What are the facilities that she is offered? So, the exosystem has an impact on the development of the child, which if we see, what the workplace policies are, we may think that it has no direct impact on the child. But the workplace policies has an impact on how available the parent is going to be the child, and that is how it has an impact on the child. The next system was the macro system, which consisted of broader cultural values, laws and governmental resources. For example, we looked at, we talked about previously once in terms of son preference in our society. So, if the culture is emphasizing on sons and not looking at daughters, then how is the growth of girls impacted? What is the sex ratio of girls in a country? So, if they are valued, what happens to them? If the government, for example, has now come up with many policies and is promoting, girl child education and protecting the girl child, then the value of the girl child changes. So, the macro system then actually has a direct influence of the survival of the child as well. Then comes the chrono system, which looks at changes which occur during a child's life, both personally, like the birth of a sibling, or culturally, like a war taking place in the country. So, what happens in this is that if a new child is born into the family, the status of the child changes. The attention that they were getting changes because there is somebody new to look after. How are they involved in the family? How does their position change? Will have an impact on their growth. The other thing in the chrono system that he talks about is, larger events like wars. So, if a child is born at a relatively calmer and peaceful time, what are the kind of systems available to them? And if they are born during a war in the country, whether it is a civil war or there are other acts of terrorism, they may become more anxious, or they may not have access to basic needs which they would have in peaceful times. All these systems in combination would have an impact on the growth and development of the child. So, the ecological theory focuses on the micro and the macro aspects of the environment, but it has been critiqued for the fact that it does not look into the biological and cognitive factors at all, which are also a part of the growth and development of the individual. But this theory, because it looks at micro and macro aspects, has influenced social policy, as I mentioned before as well. So, for social workers, this becomes an important theory which is utilized very often. Also because it helps the social workers to work in the different systems of micro, macro, chrono and exosystem, so that at different levels they can intervene. That is why this theory is very relevant. It brings us to the end of the different theories in this module. Now, let me go back a little bit about what we have discussed today. We started with looking at what is development, what are the various issues in development which were related to nature versus nurture, continuity versus discontinuity, early and late experiences. As you can see, the different theories have dealt with different issues, and some emphasize nature, some emphasize nurture, some look at early development, some look at later developments. After looking at that, we looked at the different stages of human development and how the biological, psychological, socio-cultural and life cycle forces work together to influence the individual. We also looked at the psychodynamic theories, in which we looked at psychosexual theory of Freud and the psychosocial theory of Erikson. Along with that, ethology and ecological theories of development were also looked at. It is important to remember that, in spite of the fact that these theories are emphasizing different aspects, they actually work together to help us understand the entire process of development. So, they are not really contradictory, but they complement each other to produce a whole. We have come to the end of this module of theories of development. We have covered the first part today, and we have looked at this concept of development, the issues that are there in development, the kind of different forces of biology, psychology and socio-cultural forces which affect the development of the individual. In addition to that, we introduced you to these theories of psychodynamic theories, ethological theories and ecological theories. Some of the important theories that social workers deal with, like I mentioned before, is the ecological systems theory, because it covers different systems which allow the person to intervene at different levels and work with the individuals. And it is also very holistic in nature. Therefore, this is a theory that we work with most often. But it is important to remember that all theories complement each other and are important in understanding the growth and development of the individual. I would also request you to go through the reading material in text, because what we are giving you here is an overview of the theories and a basic understanding of the concepts mentioned by the theorist. Their detailed examples need to be gone through with the help of references and further reading. Thank you.